Good morning. Looks like I'm recording. Hey, this is Karen. This is what I was busy doing while you were listening to Vicki Mincy's lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit today about Executive Director as Change Agent so that you can enjoy this at your leisure while I'm in Cuba at my leisure, learning new stuff. Anyhow, I hope everybody's having a good break or beginning to the break, or you start your break right after this class, right? Anyhow. Today's lecture is about Executive Director as Change Agent. As those of you who have worked in the nonprofit sector or just about anywhere know, change is part of the turf. I liked this quote from the Carlson Donahoe book, "Nonprofits are the conduit through which individuals channel their ideas, passions, and resources and initiate change that's intended to improve the lives of the people they serve and the communities in which they live." Sounds like community development work, doesn't it? And yes, nonprofits equal change. Nonprofits were, basically created to, a way to create a better world. And in the nonprofit sector, you know what they say about Michigan weather, like we've experienced all winter. Just stick around till tomorrow and it'll be different. That's often the way things are in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits are, often incubators of new ideas, and so change is constant. New is often the operative word, and sometimes they're the way of, testing ideas that then become more popular, just like sometimes small businesses are like that. I mean, think about food co-ops in the old days, if you're old enough to remember that. Food co-ops were all about bulk foods, and you had to go to a co-op to get bulk foods for a while, and then suddenly there was the incredible bulk food store that I remember in Royal Oak, and a number of other even conventional businesses, even to this day, still sell bulk foods instead of prepackaged foods. Think about the way that they were used. You heard Vicki talk about low-income housing tax credits and housing development projects. The first two low-income housing tax credit projects that were done in the city of Detroit were done by nonprofits, one in Cass Corridor and one over on East Grand Boulevard. And it was a way of, kind of testing how that was going to work in the local environment. So if you remember Vicki's lecture about open systems theory, when we discussed different circles of influences, nonprofits like, other organizations are definitely subject to both internal and external factors that cause for, or that, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, that present a need for change. See, external factors. Okay. Yeah, the political environment is sometimes an external factor. I mean, for instance, think about was it 2012 when a new charter was passed? We had our first election of council by district in Detroit. That really changed the ways that nonprofits and others could communicate with the city. And then Mayor Duggan came along and established the Office of Neighborhoods, which gave us yet another platform for interacting with the city. So definitely, and we'll think about changes that have happened as a result of Trump's election, and we have maybe some new opportunities as a result of Gretchen Whitmer's election in the state of Michigan. We have yet to see how that will change some policy, but it's beginning to happen. The social environment. Think about, excuse me, if you think about changes in demographics in the community, or changes in what's considered acceptable socially, whatever, that is sometimes, or changes in the economic environment, be it increased unemployment or new business opportunities, that sometimes can affect even things in the nonprofit sector. And of course, the funding environment, and it's an area of constant change that affects the nonprofit community. I mean, for instance, and sometimes affects city government and others too. For example, one of the things that when Obama was elected was all about was energy conservation. He established some pots of money and got them through Congress in order to have energy conservation block grants that were available to cities, as well as some private environmental conservation or energy conservation opportunities that were available to states and in the nonprofit sector. That didn't last very long with changes in Congress, but it did create some real change. And we've also heard about other federal and other federal funds that are considered possible for elimination. There's still talk of cutting back even further on block grant investment to cities, which then affects the nonprofit sector because we're the beneficiary of some of those. And sometimes foundations make changes. For example, I've worked about 8 or 9 years ago since I worked for an organization that was very invested in doing work with early childhood and families, both local families and immigrant families that were new to the area. Had a really hard time finding sources of funding that they could pursue. And now Kresge, Kellogg, and several other of the larger foundations, Skillman, have really done some analysis and decided that early childhood education is a need, and so there are new pots of money available for that kind of work if that work is part of your mission. Whereas the interest in things like general operating support for community development neighborhood organizations has kind of waned. There's not much opportunity for that. Let's see, another thing that's changed in the environment, or other external factors, are ways that we communicate. I mean, think about how we used to have to talk on the phone or drop notes in people's mailboxes or use U.S. mail. Since our communication has changed, it has made information so much more accessible. It has made the ability to contact each other immediately very possible. And that has changed a lot of the ways that both nonprofits and for-profits do business. It also, for us, has changed the way we often submit our grant applications and grant supports, now that there's more electronic communication available. We'll talk about that more when we talk about fundraising a couple of weeks from now. Can you think of other external factors that have affected the nonprofit sector, both in Detroit or elsewhere? Why don't you make a few notes and we'll talk about them next week if we have time, okay? Now, nonprofit, excuse me, not used to recording myself. As we learned again when Linda talked about open systems theory, changes in these external circles of influence often cause the need for internal changes. Internal changes are sometimes driven by other internal factors. For instance, changes in board leadership. Election or appointment of a new chair to your board of directors could change the way that you do business, could change a bit about what the board focuses on or prioritizes focusing on, even if they're aware of their key roles and responsibilities. An example I like to cite in terms of internal factors is that when I was the executive director at Creekside, it was a new organization. I was the first paid staff person. That was one major change, and just getting used to me being there was a challenge for the board. But within about 18 months, about midstream of my term as director there, we had 3 key board members die. Those 3 key board members were all board members who really understood how to interact with an executive director, were more open to the need for change in the organization, and it really did change the way that we did business, losing those 3 members, and took us a while to find others with the similar kinds of skills and values to fill those slots. We were partly successful, but not entirely successful. Changes in executive director leadership is another big internal factor. Executive directors aren't there forever, and I think particularly as some of the past leadership has aged out, finding new executive directors is a challenge that boards face. And as we learned in the couple of case studies that we've done, a change in executive director leadership might bring a new style, might affect organizational culture or challenge current organizational culture. Then Other internal factors, oh, that's right, I almost forgot to mention that at any rate, the executive director sometimes has to convince the board and others to recognize the need for change. If there are changes in leadership, if there are changes in the external environment, things that we used to be able to count on, or people we used to be able to count on that are gone, sometimes the executive director has to convince others that there is a need to change the way that the organization operates. It can, and sometimes changes impact sometimes changes in the economy can impact neighborhood stability. We didn't talk about economy a lot, but at any rate, change always comes with risks and opportunities, and if we learn how to seize those opportunities and marshal people that we work with to seize those opportunities, we've done our job and stand a better chance of seizing those opportunities instead of taking backward steps. Yeah, the nonprofit leader, as I said before, has to be an ambassador for change. Have to convince the board, have to convince constituents that change is needed, have to sometimes convince staff that changes in roles and responsibilities are needed, have to be willing to interact with political representatives and others to talk about the need for change in the either in the external systems or internal systems that need to be modified. So, oh, I forgot that I had these clever little little bullet points. Yeah, delivering the message internally to your board and other constituents, lead the change process we already talked about, figuring out how to best message things. I mean, for example, when a key leader leaves, want to make sure that you send a positive message about how this is an opportunity for new leadership rather than scuttlebutt about, oh, they left because they weren't happy or they left because they were tired or whatever. You want to make sure you send a positive message in order to keep the image of your organization strong and positive. It's especially important when you interact with neighborhood residents or other, very close to what you're doing constituents. I liked the change process that was laid out in pages 130, 131, I believe it was, of the text. I thought it was a nice, well thought out structure for thinking through creating change. Takes a very logical, rational approach in terms of methodology, but also doesn't leave out the emotional side of things and leaves a few opportunities to dealing with ways that people resist change. I'm sure you've heard people say when you've proposed a change or been in an atmosphere where change is looking like it's needed, some people saying we've always done it this way. Be that in your family, we always go to 10 o'clock mass on Sunday. We don't, and then go to breakfast afterwards. That was my family's habit when I was a kid. Or we always have our meetings on Mondays. Or we always take things in this order on the agenda. Or we always invite these people to be sponsors of our annual event. Anyhow, sometimes the people get caught up in the way that things used to be done rather than looking for opportunities to create change. Anyhow, the change process in the text was about envisioning what could be as change happens, communicating with each other about that, setting some goals around what the change might look like and how we'll have something to measure the effectiveness of our change against, defining individuals' roles in planning for and creating the change, again, setting benchmarks, kind of smaller sub-goals in order to mark our progress. When all of that theorizing and planning is done, it's similar to it's a strategic planning process, essentially. Take action, try it out, what you've conceived. Look for learning opportunities, both for you to learn as an organization or for individuals, board members, staff members, or others to increase their skills in order to be able to better deal in the new environment. Okay. I don't know why these are coming back, but oh well. Yeah, take action, look for learning opportunities, and celebrate. I think celebrating change is important, just like celebrating victories is important. We have to remember the human side of things. So basically celebrate and enjoy yourselves and work on building community. Also important to do an emotional checkup. Some people in your organization may deal with changes better than others, and it's important as a leader to sit down with them, see how they're feeling, see how they stand, or see how they're feeling, see where they stand in terms of changes that are underway, and see if there are ways that you can either get them more, hear what they have to say, get them more engaged in the change process, and find a role that's a good fit for them. Think about examples of that, and again, make some notes. And we also the text also talks a little bit about, I think, different sectors. And I like this quote that Paul Light, a professor at NYU, I think it's from a lecture or a book. I wish that I could find the source quickly. Anyhow, contrary to the common belief that the nonprofit sector should operate more like business, we should instead be remodeling business to look more like nonprofits. And I see some of this happening in terms of change in our nonprofit and for-profit environment now. Nonprofits, as we've discussed before, are largely mission-driven. It's about creating change. It's about improving quality of life for residents or other constituents that we serve. A challenge that nonprofits sometimes face is balancing the mission with a sustainable business model. This is what our mission is. This is what we want to do. How are we going to find the funding to do it? How are we going to keep people engaged to do it? And so it's really a resource and people juggling act in order to remain sustainable. For-profits are very much bottom line driven, profit driven, but maybe not all. Challenges that they sometimes face is balancing the bottom line with their commitment to corporate social responsibility if they have one. Some larger corporations do have foundations, and banks certainly have foundations or other mechanisms for investing in social causes. And it's not necessarily incumbent on, not necessarily mandatory that businesses have a social responsibility focus, but on the other hand, it's important, I think, as our society grows and changes, that for-profit businesses become more generous. And we do have some good examples of this in the community. We have some, even the big three each have foundations, and local banks have foundations, but sometimes small businesses are very generous in their community. I found sometimes knocking on the doors of small businesses in communities that I worked in was able to get us even small things, be it coffee or refreshments for a meeting, to a place to hold a meeting, when I was at Creekside, the veterinarian in the community was very active and supportive of our tree planting and donated trees. When I was at Creekside, the now gone big boy could always be counted on to donate coffee and other refreshments for our tree plantings or park cleanups or other things. So it's not always just about the big businesses or about cash, but you can sometimes look to the for-profit sector. And there are ways these days where I think we're increasingly seeing these two sectors blended. Venture philanthropy or impact investment really takes concepts that are part of venture capital and business management and applies them to philanthropic needs or goals. For instance, some of the larger foundations make loans to nonprofits for social change related projects, or make other kinds of investments. Also, if you look at and then social entrepreneurship, If you look at things like the New Economy Initiative or Invest Detroit or other mechanisms we have now that use philanthropic funds to invest in small businesses, be they women-owned businesses, black-owned businesses, other minority-owned businesses. Think about what Global Detroit does with small minority business, or rather small immigrant businesses that are trying, as people try to get themselves established as Detroiters. And I think cooperatives also provide a blended model for how for-profit and nonprofit worlds cross because cooperatives are for-profit businesses, but they're mission-driven, they're member-driven, and be happy to talk with you about cooperatives in detail at another point. But we have had some interest from the local foundation community and investment funds in the People's Food Co-op that I'm involved in developing now. Happy to say that we're on their radar screen and getting some help in getting the business launched, and that people understand that we're meeting a need both for more community engagement and for access to fresher and healthier foods in the city. Yeah, again, I said some examples to explore in terms of venture philanthropy or nurturing entrepreneurs from the sorry, losing my voice. Nurturing entrepreneurship in order to create social change, the New Economy Initiative based at the Community Foundation, the Invest Detroit Fund, Global Detroit, and a book that I found interesting to read was by a woman named Jerry Larkin called Building a Business the Buddhist Way. It's about taking a mindful approach to building businesses. Jerry Larkin was for a number of years a very successful management consultant who quit to become a Buddhist monk. She was the leader at the Buddhist temple here in Detroit for a while. And her book is about mindfulness in business, using Buddhist principles to build a business with integrity. She did some consulting with Avalon Bakery when they first opened, and I think she's done some work with other local businesses too. So recommend that book. Another favorite book of mine that she wrote was called Stumbling Toward Enlightenment. I think that's definitely a nice read in terms of personal development if you're interested in mindful living. Or can you think of other examples that are happening these days that blend the for-profit and nonprofit sector? Again, make some notes, and we can talk about them another time. Just to reiterate, change equals opportunity. Change isn't always a bad thing. Change is sometimes necessary, change is sometimes unavoidable, but it definitely is an opportunity to do something new, to rethink your approach, to rethink your business plan, to make you or your organization more effective. Any questions? Shoot me some emails or whatever, or if there are things you want to talk about in a later class for a few minutes, or talk about offline, let me know. The text also talks about life cycles, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail because you've already read the book on life cycle, on measuring life cycles. Just do a kind of a quick summary. The startup phase is the first phase of organizational life cycle development. It's often an all-volunteer, high-energy phase. I remember how exciting it was to be around when People for Palmer Park was being formed. There was such energy. And I think and Friends of the Rouge had such energy and were able to bring a lot of attention as volunteers to issues in those two parks, and have since become, I would say, more organizations in the development phase, but still have are still having impact. The development phase often involves having one paid staff person, or people dedicated to very specific functions, formalization of structures, institution of policies. I think I mentioned before in a former class back in my Creekside days, as the first staff person, I had to really help the board think through policies or present draft policies. for them that would affect our hiring, the way we handled our finances, whatever, in order to lay the foundation for future growth. A lot of what you have to do in the development phase is think about what it's going to take to continue to grow and stabilize. And expansion and growth may mean growth in your programs. Probably at that point have a strategic plan that you put together in your development phase. And now you're looking for ways to build on that strategic plan to grow your organization, be that growths in programs or growths in funding to support those programs. In that phase, the board probably moves more toward a governance role and away from a hands-on role, whereas in startup and development, the board members are often the ones who are either hands-on managing or making the activities happen. In the expansion and growth phase, it also certainly means more authority for the executive director and probably the addition of staff if financial resources are there. As an organization moves into the maturity phase, growth sometimes levels off. Formalized procedures are the norm. You have a point of reference to go back to say, here's how we handle this kind of situation. Say you've got a staff person who isn't performing. You've hopefully got a way to evaluate that person and put together some kind of a plan for corrective action. You've got systems, your internal controls in place that you can use as you look at how your financial systems are working and make sure that you're well protected. And that certainly is a level where accountability, accountability increases and the need for accountability becomes even more visible. Many organizations function as mature organizations for a long time. Hopefully they do some ongoing strategic planning or strategic plan modification in order to keep up with all of the changes in their environment and internal changes that they're facing. Ultimately, they may hit a point of crisis and restructuring. Sometimes there's a major change internally or externally that necessitates that. I was involved in, it's a time where you may need to reevaluate your systems and your programs, do some introspection to see, and do some external surveying to see if you're really being effective in what you're doing and how restructuring could help you continue to be effective in meeting your mission. If it's a period where you've brought in new leadership, sometimes new leaders mean new creative energy. Ultimately, crisis and restructuring could lead to expansion, could lead to increased program effectiveness, or sometimes lead you more into a decline and close phase, depending on how well the people involved can manage the change and see opportunities and seize them and also take corrective action as needed. And then the last of the life cycles is declining and closing. That's a period where you certainly have to have a lot more inward focus. It sometimes is caused by major changes in the environment internally or externally, loss of trust or whatever internally. You don't necessarily trust the people involved. Somebody has made a major or unethical error in the way that they're handling the organization. On the other hand, this is sometimes also an opportunity that will flip you back to restructuring. In my days at LISC, I was involved in, I think, 3 different mergers of organizations. Each time a small nonprofit housing corporation saw that it had done what it could do and its future was limited, and was able to approach a larger nonprofit organization and merge their missions and interests, and sometimes keep staff in place and continue with the mission, but with maybe more resources. Yeah, there were 3 small organizations in Southwest Detroit. Swan was a housing organization. Bagley Housing and All Saints Housing were all very small, very grassroots driven, very community connected nonprofit organizations. They merged with Southwest Solutions Housing as time went on, and I think brought some new ways of doing business to them because of their community connection. I think that's about it. Let me see. Yeah, okay. That's about it. I hope this was helpful and connected to what you read and has you thinking about ways of managing change and ways of making your organizations more effective. Looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks when we're all back together. Take care. Have a good, a good spring break, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.